We want to make our own cars. We don't really want cars from Canada. And we put tariffs on cars from Canada.
What began as a promise to protect American jobs is now threatening to fracture the entire North American auto industry. New tariffs imposed by Donald Trump, framed as a weapon to win the trade war, are already forcing factories to move, workers to lose jobs, and allies to rethink their loyalty to the United States. In Canada, the impact has been immediate and political. Major automakers that once accepted billions in public support are now pulling production south, triggering anger in Ottawa and outrage among Canadian consumers. This is no longer just a dispute over cars. It is a test of how far economic pressure can go before it backfires. Canada is not only a supplier, it is one of the largest customers for American-made vehicles. And now, that customer is openly discussing retaliation, limits, and even boycotts. If this escalation continues, the damage may not stop at the border. Listen to the end, because the next part reveals the hidden number that could shock the United States auto industry. What makes this moment far more dangerous is not the factory closures themselves, but what happened after them. Ottawa did not respond with speeches. It responded with leverage. Canada formally moved to restrict how many United States-built vehicles certain automakers can bring into the Canadian market without penalties. At the same time, officials signaled that subsidy agreements would be enforced, not renegotiated. In plain terms, companies that accepted public money and then shifted jobs south would face consequences. This marks a turning point in the trade war. Until now, tariffs were treated as a political tool. Canada is treating them as a breach of trust. The message to the industry is clear. Market access is no longer guaranteed simply because geography once made it convenient. For the United States, this creates a silent but severe risk. Canada is not a marginal buyer. It is one of the largest export destinations for American vehicles, parts, and components. If even a fraction of Canadian consumers begin redirecting purchases away from United States brands, the loss will not appear as a headline factory shutdown. It will show up slowly, quarter by quarter, in falling exports, shrinking dealer inventories, and weaker earnings reports. Automakers understand this danger, which is why anxiety inside the industry is rising. Executives are now caught between political pressure at home and commercial retaliation abroad. Build more in the United States and risk losing Canada as a customer. Protect Canadian operations and risk penalties under the tariff regime. There is no cost-free option. Meanwhile, competitors outside North America are watching closely. Japanese, South Korean, and European manufacturers see opportunity in uncertainty. If Canada decides its future cannot depend entirely on the United States, new partnerships and new supply chains become not just possible, but logical. This is how trade conflicts quietly reshape industries, not through one dramatic collapse, but through a sequence of decisions that slowly lock in new habits and new alliances. And there is one statistic buried in the trade data that explains why this confrontation could hit the United States harder than anyone in Washington expects. Listen to the end, because the next part exposes that number and why it could change everything. The real danger now shifts from politics to arithmetic. Once purchasing behavior changes, it rarely snaps back. Canada imports tens of billions of dollars worth of vehicles every year, and a large share of those vehicles come from the United States. That flow supports American assembly plants, supplier networks, logistics firms, dealerships, and tens of thousands of workers whose jobs never appear in tariff speeches. Here is the structural problem for Washington. A trade war does not only punish exporters, it reshapes buyers. When Canadian consumers or fleet purchasers switch brands, they do not merely delay a purchase. They form new relationships, service contracts move, financing moves, parts ecosystems move. Over time, loyalty moves. And once those ties are established, price cuts alone rarely bring customers back. For American automakers, this creates a slow-burning financial risk. Fewer Canadian sales mean lower production volumes. Lower volumes mean higher per-unit costs. Higher costs mean tighter margins or higher sticker prices. That pressure then flows directly to American households, especially older buyers who rely on predictable pricing and long vehicle replacement cycles. The result is not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual erosion of competitiveness. Canada, meanwhile, faces a different calculation. Losing factories is painful, but losing dependence can be empowering. When trade stability disappears, diversification becomes policy. This is why discussions around non-United States suppliers, alternative partnerships, and new manufacturing strategies are accelerating. Not because Canada wants confrontation, but because reliance has become a liability. This shift matters deeply for the United States economy. Canada is not an emerging market that can be replaced overnight. It is a mature, wealthy, geographically integrated partner. When access to that market weakens, the lost demand does not automatically reappear elsewhere. Europe is saturated. Asia is fiercely competitive. Domestic demand alone cannot absorb all displaced production without price concessions. The tariffs were designed to force companies to choose sides. Instead, they may be forcing customers to do the same. And customers vote differently than corporations. They vote with wallets, long-term contracts, and replacement cycles measured in years, not election seasons. Inside the auto industry, analysts are beginning to ask a question that few politicians want to answer publicly. What happens if this confrontation does not end quickly? What happens if Canada decides that rebuilding its auto future without heavy reliance on the United States is no longer a theory, but a strategy? Because if that line is crossed, the consequences will not be reversible with a single policy announcement. They will be locked into factories, supply chains, and consumer habits for a generation. And there is one strategic move Canada is quietly considering that could accelerate this shift faster than any boycott ever could. Listen to the end, because the next part reveals the move that could permanently redraw the North American auto map. Behind the public dispute over factories and tariffs, a far more consequential calculation is taking shape. Canada is beginning to ask a question it has avoided for decades. What if dependence on the United States is no longer a strength, but a strategic risk? Once that question enters government policy rooms, trade conflicts stop being temporary and start becoming structural. Here is where the trade war enters a new phase. Canada currently maintains one of the highest barriers in the world against electric vehicles from China, effectively sealing off that supply. But multiple trade and industry signals suggest Ottawa is reassessing that position, not as an act of defiance, but as leverage. China has indicated a willingness to reopen its markets to Canadian agricultural exports in exchange for access to the Canadian electric vehicle market. For Canada, this is not ideology, it is arithmetic. Canada controls critical minerals, clean electricity, and advanced manufacturing capacity. If foreign electric vehicle manufacturers are allowed to partner or build locally, Canada does not merely replace United States imports. It restructures its auto sector around new supply chains. That shift would weaken the negotiating power of American automakers almost immediately. For the United States, this is the high-risk scenario. Tariffs were intended to pull production inward. Instead, they may be pushing a close ally to diversify outward. Once Canada secures alternative suppliers and domestic electric vehicle production with non-United States partners, lost market share is unlikely to return. This is how trade wars are lost quietly. Not through collapse or crisis, but through fewer purchase orders, lower export volumes, and strategic decisions that lock in new habits for years. Washington appears focused on forcing compliance. Ottawa is preparing for independence. Those strategies are on a collision course. And the next consequence will not be confined to vehicle sales. It will spread into parts suppliers, logistics corridors, and employment across multiple American states. That impact is already forming beneath the surface, and it becomes visible in the next phase of this story. When the consequences arrive, they will not land evenly. They will strike specific American states, specific workers, and specific industries long before Washington feels political pressure. That is what makes this phase of the trade war especially dangerous. The damage will be dispersed, delayed, and therefore easier to ignore until it becomes irreversible. The first pressure point is not assembly plants. It is the supplier network. Thousands of American companies depend on cross-border auto trade with Canada for components, tooling, transport, and specialized services. When Canadian demand weakens or shifts to non-United States brands, these suppliers do not receive a warning headline. They receive smaller orders, then shorter contracts, then layoffs. This pattern has already appeared in past trade disputes, and it unfolds quietly. Next comes logistics. Rail corridors, trucking routes, and border hubs built around auto flows depend on volume. A sustained drop in vehicle and part shipments erodes profitability across transportation firms, many of them based in Midwestern and Great Lakes states. These are not abstract losses. They translate into fewer shifts, reduced hours, and pressure on regional economies that are already sensitive to industrial cycles. Then there is the consumer effect inside the United States itself. Lower export volumes weaken economies of scale. When factories run below optimal capacity, costs rise. Those costs eventually surface as higher prices, fewer model options, or delayed updates. Older American buyers, who tend to keep vehicles longer and budget carefully, feel this shift first. What was framed as protection quietly becomes inflation. This is where the political narrative starts to break. Tariffs promise strength, but fragmented demand produces fragility. If Canada reduces reliance on American vehicles while the United States loses export momentum, the auto industry ends up squeezed from both sides. Domestic demand cannot fully compensate without discounts that erode margins and investment capacity. And this is only the first layer. Once suppliers downsize, restarting capacity is slow and expensive. Once logistics networks contract, rerouting them takes years. Once consumers switch brands, loyalty does not reset automatically. The most dangerous part of this story is that none of these effects trigger an immediate crisis meeting. They accumulate quietly, quarter after quarter, until the data forces a reckoning. Because there is one final realization approaching, and it is deeply uncomfortable for policymakers. If this trajectory continues, the United States may discover that the cost of this trade confrontation is not paid at the border, but absorbed inside its own industrial base. That realization changes everything in the final stage of this conflict. Here is the twist that turns this from a trade dispute into a strategic miscalculation. The trade war was designed around the assumption that production is power. Build more cars inside the United States, and leverage follows. But modern auto economics does not reward production alone. It rewards market certainty. And tariffs destroy certainty faster than almost any other policy tool. Inside corporate boardrooms, a quiet reassessment is underway. Executives are no longer asking where labor is cheapest or where subsidies are highest. They are asking one question: where can we sell without political risk? When tariffs change unpredictably, allies become unstable markets. That is the moment companies begin planning beyond North America. Canada understands this dynamic. That is why its response is not only defensive, it is forward-looking. By signaling openness to new partners, new supply chains, and new electric vehicle ecosystems, Canada is repositioning itself as a stable hub rather than a dependent buyer. Stability attracts capital. Capital builds factories. Factories anchor trade flows. For the United States, this is the unintended consequence. Tariffs meant to secure loyalty may instead accelerate realignment. Once investment decisions are made, they are rarely reversed. Supply chains, once rerouted, tend to harden. Political pressure cannot easily undo sunk costs measured in billions and timelines measured in decades. This is why the real cost of the current strategy may not appear during the next election cycle. It may surface years later, when American manufacturers realize that lost Canadian demand was not cyclical, but structural. At that point, raising or lowering tariffs no longer matters. The market has already moved. And that leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. If Canada succeeds in reducing reliance on the United States while building new industrial partnerships, what leverage remains when the next trade dispute begins? Because in trade, leverage is not declared. It is revealed only after it is gone. That question brings us to the final reckoning, where the balance of power in North American manufacturing becomes clear. What began as a tariff dispute has now become a test of economic judgment. The trade war was sold as a way to restore strength to the United States, protect workers, and force companies to invest at home. But the unfolding reality suggests a far more complicated outcome. Canada is no longer reacting, it is adapting. And adaptation in trade is more powerful than retaliation. If Canada continues to reduce dependence on United States vehicles, diversify suppliers, and reshape its auto market, the effects will not announce themselves with a single crisis. They will appear in export data, in earnings calls, in quieter factories, and in the slow recalibration of global supply chains. By the time those signals are impossible to ignore, the opportunity to reverse course may already be gone. This is the central risk of tariffs used as blunt instruments. They can change behavior, but not always in the intended direction. They can harden alliances, or they can fracture them. And once trust erodes between trading partners, rebuilding it is far harder than imposing any duty or removing any barrier. The unanswered question now facing Washington is not whether tariffs can force compliance, but whether they have already encouraged a permanent shift. If Canada succeeds in building an auto future that relies less on the United States, then the true cost of this strategy will be measured not in headlines, but in lost influence. Is this a bold strategy or a risky mistake for the United States?